Hello and welcome to another episode of Gar Borras' Time Machine. Today, Gar, we're going all the way back in your time machine to 1971, and to give people kind of a real pinpoint of when we're talking about Black Sabbath's third album, Master of Reality, which was released on July 21st, 1971. Now, I know by the time this album came out in 71, you've told me you were already a huge Black Sabbath fan, and we previously talked about the debut album, and the reason we're talking about Master Reality today is because 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of that album. Can you believe you've been around that long, Gar?
Well, yeah, I've been around for a long time and seen a lot of things and everything, so but I'm not done yet.
Yeah, that's
so
good.
I still got some mileage left.
Now, I know that, like you were sharing with me in many of our conversations, before you were ever a singer, you started out as a bass player, and you were talking about how Black Sabbath and those early albums and Geezer Butler was a huge influence on you. So, you want to really start off on telling us like why Geezer was such a huge influence on you as far as your bass playing?
Well, it's funny because back in those days, Black Sabbath's material was considered easier material to play. But, nowadays when you look back, maybe it wasn't like these, opus compositions like what Yes was doing.
Yeah.
And, these progressive rock bands were doing. But still, I look back at their material, and there is a lot of intricacies that were kind of overlooked back in those days, because if you in my earlier years, the way that a lot of the people that I would talk to that would be musicians or people that were into music, it had a lot to do with the incredible musical abilities, like the Led Zeppelins and stuff like that, and these bands that would write very, very, super complicated stuff.
Yeah.
And you can't take it away from them. But, those bands, they were writing like incredibly complicated stuff. And when you compare Black Sabbath to that, it's not like as complicated as what some of those other bands were doing. But in retrospect, you look at it, it wasn't like rudimentary or monotonous or boring or elementary. It wasn't that. But back in those days, it was kind of funny how people, would compare and would look at Black Sabbath's material that way. And for me, because it was considered that, and I was very in the beginning stages of my musicianship and diving into learning how to play bass, I kind of gravitated towards Black Sabbath because it was kind of easier for me to pick out the bass parts.
Yeah.
But also another thing that was very, very different about their version of how they were going about their music at that time was, I don't know how to describe it.
Well, I think part of this would probably have to do with the fact that a lot of people consider Black Sabbath maybe the godfathers of heavy metal. In fact, they've even been credited with kind of inventing the genre. I was reading stuff on this particular album, Masters of Reality, just to give you kind of a viewpoint here of the time frame. At the time when the album was originally released 50 years ago, a lot of the critics looked down on the album, but now 50 years later, it's considered one of the like a heavy metal masterpiece.
Well, yeah, and they were doing what's very different from what you see that heavy metal became, because there was Black Sabbath's version of it had a lot of improvisation in it.
Yeah.
And they were Geezer Butler's bass lines. Were not just repetitive, bass lines. There was a lot of improvisation going on in his bass lines, especially during the guitar solos.
Yeah, and
it was almost like the guitarist and him were kind of soloing at the same time, and that's not rudimentary, that's not elementary, that's not simplistic music.
Almost kind of like the guitar and the bass are more in sync than even the bass and the drums, is a typical situation.
Well, yeah, it was a very different version of what hard rock and heavy metal became. Because later on, there was less and less improvisation that was going on in music. But during their time, there was a lot of improvisation going on, especially in their first three albums.
Yeah, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I dare say probably the only real bass hero that predates Geezer Butler would be maybe John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin, but they came on the scene right about the same time. And the thing is, with this album, I was reading, it's the first time that Black Sabbath kind of, especially Tony Iommi with his guitar soloing, kind of down-tuned his guitar, and Geezer did the same thing, like down-tuned his bass parts, and that kind of created what became known as not just metal, but kind of like doom metal and stoner rock, which is kind of interesting, because when you one of the tracks on this album, which is Master Reality, we're talking about, the track is Sweet Leaf, and it's such a funny tune, because I was reading up on it, and as you can imagine, it's not just about marijuana, but I was reading Geezer Butler actually wrote the song kind of like he had a love affair with marijuana, the whole band did, and when they were recording the song, Iommi was in the studio getting high off of it, and he kind of let off this kind of cough, which is kind of in the intro of the song, and they kind of like a coughing fit from getting high, and that's kind of what the base of the song was based around, and they left the cough, which is like just the band getting high. I mean, can you ever imagine a band, literally writing about, getting high and their love affair with the drug? I mean, amazing.
Well, it was a different time.
Yeah.
And it was during the hippie era. Where most of the other music that was going on was not what Black Sabbath was doing. And here's another thing that I kind of noticed over the years with a lot of bands. When they start out, the critics wind up panning them. And they just don't get any support from the critics. But yet, the listener, the people that are listening and actually choosing what they want to get into and what they want to buy, and what really gravitates towards them, has no bearing whatsoever on what a critic says. And it's actually kind of a good thing when you're doing something and you're being panned by the critics, because you always look at these different artists that get panned, and then all of a sudden, like 30
years later,
40 years later, in retrospect,
they're classic rock.
Now everybody is just going, we're not worthy. You know what I mean? About the same material that was getting completely panned. So, maybe it's a good thing when critics are panning what you're doing, because you're being rebellious, which, I've said it a whole bunch of times in a lot of these interviews. Rock and roll has a lot. One of the most critical elements of music and rock and roll and all of that is the rebellion aspect of it. And when you're being panned, it's usually because you're being rebellious and you're pushing the boundaries, and you're getting out of the box.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is the culture 50 years later. I mean, 50 years ago when the album was being created and recorded and all that, and they write the song "Sweet Leaf," which is about their love affair with the drug of marijuana. I mean, bands just you never would have thought at the time that they would be so blatant about it, but that's what I love. Like you said, it's the rebellion factor, and then you go 50 years later after the album's been released. 50 years later, after the fact, you got all these politicians doing everything they can to legalize, the drug culture, just for the simple fact of trying to get a vote. It is what it is, but it's funny how the times have changed from 50 years ago, if you know what I mean.
Well, the only thing that never changes is change.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and you said that many times too before. and
Black Sabbath, was one of those bands that changed things, because everything that was going on before then was all hippie oriented, and Crosby. I loved Crosby, Stills and Nash. Don't get me wrong. It's so different in contrast to a band like Black Sabbath. And in the sound and everything, and as a kid, I just fell head first right into the distortion, the heaviness of the sound and everything. It just that whole thing just called to me, and it was like a magnet.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I love about having these conversations. That's why we started doing it, Gar, because when I seen the vast array of influences you've had when you started listing these bands that influenced you on, your Facebook page last year. I mean, like you said, you love everything from Black Sabbath to Crosby, Stills and Nash, and I love that about you, because you study music with an open kind of ear. And your test is not if it's metal, not if it's rock, but if you like it, and it's kind of about the song and what you get off on. And as a musician, when you open yourself up to that many different types of influences, you're really a great student of music. I mean, because you're more than just about metal and hard rock and all that. You know what I mean?
Well, it was a natural thing for me.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that it was ever a thought out thing, but it just became this thing where I never based what I liked on a genre.
Yeah.
I based what I liked on the actual merits of the song. For example, I don't really care that much for country music. It's not really my cup of tea.
Yeah.
But there are country songs that there is just absolutely no denying.
Yeah.
Hey, that is a great song.
And I think that's when country kind of crosses over.
And to limit yourself like that into a genre, it never made sense to be artist. And the whole thing about being an artist is being creative.
Oh yeah.
And how can you be creative when you're limiting yourself? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and that's why Black Sabbath from 50 years ago sounds nothing like the last album they put out with Ozzy, which was like I think 2013 or whatever it was. But that's why, over the course of 50 years, the band kind of evolves. But I was reading this Masters of Reality album that we're talking about today, that's celebrating its 50th anniversary. At the time this came out, this was considered kind of an experimental album, because they were taking chances on it. If you go back and you listen to the first two Sabbath albums, kind of like a little more, you can hear the band's kind of developing its sound. On this album, they're not quite, you wouldn't really consider this kind of like commercial pop rock, but you can hear the band kind of by this album, which is the third album, kind of experimenting, trying to do different things than they did on the first two. And then by the time they get to the next album, Volume 4, I mean, that's when you have changes on there, which is really the first closest thing that Black Sabbath did to having a power ballad. And they're kind of toying with kind of being a pop band, if you will, but keeping their metal roots, if you know what I mean.
Well, going back to when you have the critics panning you, that's when you're on to something. Well, during that time, the critics were panning them, but yet they were on to something. And then later on, when all of a sudden the critics are like, oh my gosh, these, now they're getting great reviews, then all of a sudden it just becomes that time that, oh, okay, from here on, this is where it starts going downward. And it just seems, it just seems that kind of happened. They started becoming more
popular,
more sophisticated, and then a little more formulated and stuff like that. And then now all of a sudden the critics love you. Now you're on your downward.
Yeah, and trend. Like I was talking to somebody about, for example, I've been a huge Motley Crue fan since the very beginning, but then there's a percentage of people out there that knew nothing about Motley Crue, let's say, till Dr. Feelgood. They have their first #1 album all over MTV, and all of a sudden, everybody loves Motley Crue. It's like, I've been a fan since day one, but, and then some people were just there for that one album, and then after all the hits, and after the band broke up the first time, it's like, some people abandoned them, but that's kind of what we're talking about here, 50 years ago, when this album came.
It's a recurring thing. It seems to be what happens to bands. It's not just Black Sabbath.
No, it's every band we're talking about.
Yes, when you're being panned, you're on the upward. You're upwardly mobile. And then when the critics are starting to love you, now you're on your downward spiral, and it's just crazy to think of it that way, as using that as a measuring thing, but. When you look at it, and you look at a lot of stuff in retrospect, you see that as a tying thread with the history of a lot of bands.
Oh yeah, and what's interesting is since day one, Black Sabbath had a real loyal fan base. That they were not a band really, because like I said, they didn't really have a big radio hit. Even you could say maybe with Paranoid, even Iron Man, but probably the biggest hit they had was Changes, and that didn't come till the fourth album. And so, back in 1971, you didn't have MTV was breaking these bands. They, if they got a hit on the radio, that's how they did it back in the day. And they did it, but like we were talking about, these bands would not go on the road until they had an album out. And once the album comes out, they do talk about Black Sabbath, a little band from, started out in Birmingham, England, and they worked their way up to become a world famous, band. So for a band out of England at the time, it's a big deal just to get to go on a tour to America, or have your song played on the radio, not just in England, but worldwide.
Well, I think you just touched on something that really, I don't think that a lot of people really think about this.
Yeah.
England is not a gigantic country.
Yeah.
And England is actually, compared to places like the United States or Canada and a lot of other countries, England is actually kind of a small country, and it just really gives you an idea, especially at that time, in the 60s and the 70s, how important the arts were in the upbringing of their younger generations.
Yeah.
There has to have been a huge amount of importance that was going on at that time in that country, because when you look at a country that's small, and yet you look at how many extremely creative musicians and bands that came out of that country, it's actually mind-boggling.
And
because you got a country like the United States that's just this gigantic country that's got a huge, gigantic population. And, we have a lot of, creative people to be very proud of also.
Oh, yeah.
But, a small country like England can put out just as much or more.
And here's the thing with that, Gar. I mean, most of the bands that were coming out of England back in the 60s and 70s were centered out of like London, which I think is the capital of England. And Black Sabbath was not from London; they were from Birmingham, England, which is a little industrial town. Which I've heard the guys talk over the years about. That's why on those early Sabbath albums, it's got a real industrial sound. I mean, like we said, they get credited so often, Sabbath, with kind of creating the metal sound because Tony Iommi was years ago before the band ever existed when he was a teenager in a horrible accident where the tips of two of his fingers were cut off by an electric saw, and that's why he plays the way he does, and because he was forced to play that way, it kind of created that sound we were talking about, that Sabbathy sound that.
They created it, man. There's no denying it whatsoever. I was around and I was listening to music. They are the creators of that.
And to take it a step further, here's the thing. Being from Birmingham, which is an industrial part of England, where a lot of guys, Sabbath guys, early on, when they were much younger, before they were ever playing music, they worked in some of these factories, and they would hear all these machines and stuff, and that kind of influenced the Sabbath sound as well. And it's kind of interesting. Like when looking at Master of Reality, this was one of the first albums where Tony Iommi he had like two instrumentals on this album. One was Embryo, which kind of starts off the album. It's kind of just a little tasty, like a few seconds of a like instrumental thing, but not too many guitar players at that time, except for this even predates Van Halen, because the first Van Halen album was The Eruption wasn't released until 1978. So back then people didn't really put a lot of instrumental tracks on their albums, and so that's how experimental this was at the time.
Yeah, and there's some good aspects to it.
Yeah.
But I think there's sometimes when you're being creative like that, it can kind of slow down.
Yeah.
The creative process, because of part of being creative is trial and error.
Yeah.
And not everything works.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Not
everything works, and then some things have to wind up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
And but that I think you have to the only way to change things is to
experiment,
get out of the box, and to be creative, and to start looking at how you can blaze a new trail. Okay, there's no trail here, but does that mean there can't be a trail here? And it all comes down to being experimental.
Yeah. And a couple more notes on a couple of these other tracks. Another track I really loved on this album is Into the Void. To me, it's just a metal masterpiece. It's where you can kind of hear Ozzy really come to life. He's really developing for the first time as a singer, because on a lot of these early classic Black Sabbath albums, the vocalist is not even really the main key ingredient. I mean, it's more about the riffing, the bass player and the guitar player, Iommi, and Geezer Butler. And Geezer, people may be surprised, was not just a great bass player, but he wrote a lot of the lyrics in the early days, because as I was talking to somebody else recently about Ozzy Osbourne, Ozzy really didn't know how to write a song back in the day. It was really Randy Rhoads kind of taught him how to write a song on these early Sabbath tunes. From what I understand, Ozzy would just kind of go in the studio and kind of just riff his lyrics out kind of as he's doing the vocals, but Geezer wrote a lot of those lyrics.
Well, it's funny how everyone grows.
Yeah, yeah.
What you see a person early in their career and what they're capable of doing compared to what they wind up evolving into later. It's just kind of a testament to that particular artist's growth.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that there's a lot of that, a lot of that music that Ozzy wound up doing after Randy died.
Yeah.
That's really, really good stuff.
And that's why.
But you'll also notice that after the album that Ozzy did with Randy, a lot of the other albums that you listen to, the vocals are doubled.
Yeah, yeah.
That just started becoming a staple of Ozzy's vocal sound to kind of thicken up his voice. But a trained ear I can hear it right away. That vocal has been doubled. But most other listeners, because they don't know what to listen for and stuff like that, they don't really hear it. But there were tracks on Masters of Reality. I know there's at least one track where that's where they first started doubling Ozzy's voice.
Yeah, it might have been Children of the Grey, which to me, if you listen to that track, that's where I hear kind of the Sabbath sound kind of is born right there on that song.
Well, yeah, but later on, doubling his voice became a staple.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's another part of that experimentation aspect of Masters of Reality that you were talking about. Just a small little detail like that.
Yeah.
But it obviously it was something that was worthy of becoming a staple to be used all the time.
Yeah, and just to talk about the influence of this album and the band as a whole on so many people worldwide. Well, like the track, probably my favorite track on here is the one called "After Forever." Now, from their inception, a lot of people have kind of thought of Sabbath as that they were satanic worshipers. They wore all black. They wore these crosses. They kind of went with that. But this song, I was reading, Geezer actually wrote about it's about his Christian upbringing. And so people were surprised to find out, oh, wait, he's a Christian? He was raised Christian? Oh, wait, and he's in this band Sabbath? I thought they were, devil worshippers. And they kind of played with that image. But to talk about the influence Sabbath has had on so many people, they've influenced everybody from like Eddie Van Halen, if you can believe, the Christian metal band Stryper. I mean, a few years ago on one of their newer releases, Stryper does a cover of that song "After Forever," man, and it sounds just as good as the original track here.
Well, they were an influence on. There's just a plethora of bands, including a lot of the grunge bands from Seattle.
Oh yeah, I mean,
they adopted that type of sound, that plodding, slow, like body moving riff.
I mean,
type of rock.
To kind of take that point home. I mean, I dare say probably the two bands that come to mind that you could really almost say were the bastard children of Sabbath would be Pantera and Alice in Chains. That's why I wasn't a huge fan of a lot of those grunge bands, but I loved Alice in Chains because they always had kind of a Sabbathy vibe to what they were doing. And then Pantera, when Phil Anselmo got in the band, they became a much heavier band, and they really had a Sabbathy thing going. The thing with Pantera is they weren't really like a Sabbath clone band. They had their own thing going on as well.
They were just influenced.
Yeah.
Not a clone.
Yeah.
But there's just so many bands that but you just can never take it away from them that they were the ones that started it all. And and I think it was, for me, gravitating towards it, it was this natural thing. I wasn't aware of it,
Yeah.
but it was the dark side, that
The
whole
dark
thing
side.
about scary movies and everything like that. It just so tied into all of that. It just became this natural magnet for me. And yeah, you're right. Simple minds, people that want to put things into their own little box will, take a band like Black Sabbath and try to label them satanic and everything like that. But that's somebody that obviously really doesn't know anything about the band.
Yeah.
Were they angels? No, they weren't angels. But were they promoting evil and things like that?
Not really,
no.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you have people with these simple minds that don't even want it to look into it to verify any. They just want. That's the impression they get. Then that's what they are.
I mean,
and basing their whole thing on an impression that they got, not something that's based on anything that that you can really back up or anything. It's just basing it on an impression. But Sabbath back in those days, were just so many simple minds were trying to label them with that, and it really wasn't that. It was just kind of like an ambiance for them. Yeah,
and what's interesting is I love the way that the band kind of went with it. Like we're going to kind of go. We're going to wear these crosses. We're going to wear the black in the photos, and we're going to kind of run with it, and so I just love the fact that they kind of made it work for them.
Well, yeah, they created a whole new thing, because they're obviously they were really onto something, and they were trailblazers. Because there's a lot of other bands that followed that whole lead and went with them in what this whole sound that they were creating. It's at that time in the late '60s, distortion guitar was not. It was being done, but it was not being done to that degree.
And that's what I think really made Sabbath stand out at the time was, even on, some of the earlier albums, you had stuff like Iron Man and, Paranoid, which was kind of considered a little more pop because that was the stuff that they were getting played on the radio. But, they didn't have a hit with that, and then all of a sudden say, okay, we're gonna kind of go pop now, but they stay true to their roots. That's what I love about like Sabbath. They kind of go in, whatever came out, and they didn't do anything just like to try to get a hit. It's like they had a hit, and when you really look deep into the story, it's an amazing story that whole metal sound, that whole Sabbath sound, the whole reason it was created, not because they were trying to be creative that way, but that's what came out because of the way Iommi was, because of his accent, the way he had to play guitar. He could have, when his two tips of his fingers were cut off, he could have just said, I'm going to hang up my guitar and I'm going to find something else to do. But he soldiered on, and it's a great story just right there,
Well, okay, there's there was a lot of critics during that time, and if somebody wrote something like this about me, to me, this would be such a badge that I would be so proud of, and I would be so proud of it. There was a critic that basically was casting Black Sabbath as a Titanic-style house band on the eve of Armageddon, cranking it as the bomb drops.
Oh, yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
They're seeing this in a negative light.
Yeah.
For a metalhead, that's a badge.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? For a hard rock musician, that is just probably one of the best ways that you would want to be described because it's so over the top, dark, black.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's the way one critic was describing them. You know, and you know, any real true rocker musician,
Yeah.
you know, that would be a badge.
And yeah, you know, and you got to have a lot of respect for Iommi too, because he's been the one constant in the band from day one. I mean, they've gone through many lineup changes, but he's the only guitar player they've ever had in the ranks. And I've seen people debate on, you know, maybe they should have had been a 2-guitar band. I can't even imagine that. You know, he's one of those players. Like I put him right up there with guys like you know, Brian May, and that's another guy I just could not see playing in a band with another guitar player, just because their playing is such an important key element of the band. You know.
Well, you know, I think the best way to put it in perspective is you know, especially during that time in the 70s,
yeah,
a lot of musicians, you know, because of course I was surrounded by musicians because you know, of course, you know, most people, you know, they're so heavily influenced by music,
yeah,
they want to learn how to play guitar too.
yeah.
But there was so many musicians that I was surrounded with that based whether something was good on how challenging it was to play.
Yeah, yeah.
On how hard it was and how complicated it was. And you know, and if it was easy to play, those musicians would pan it.
Yeah, yeah.
And but you know, for me, you know, you can't base whether something is good just solely on how challenging it is to play, how hard or how complicated it is. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
great music is created by the musician, and it's the listener that actually decides whether it's great or not. And the masses are not musicians. They just know when they hear music and they go, now that sounds good. And then, you know, when the masses decide whether something is good or not, they decide by how much they're going to consume it.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's certain musicians like Tony Iommi, the second you hear that guitar playing, the very second you hear it,
You know it's him.
immediately know it's Tony Iommi.
Oh yeah, and you know the thing too is, I mean, again, 50 years later after this album came out, I mean, these days you're not just going to hear Sabbath like on a metal station. They're considered like classic rock now. So there's very well a chance that you might hear on a classic rock station, you might hear them being played on the same station as say like Queen or, you know, the Eagles or something like that. And it's kind of interesting because 50 years on, they're classic rock now.
Well, you know, I just have a feeling that, you know, their music, you know, is ever evolving, and I don't think that music is done evolving.
Oh no.
I just think that, you know, when something new comes out, and when somebody comes up with something that's out of the box, as soon as the critics are panning it,
Yeah.
pay attention.
Yeah. And, you know, there's another tune I want to talk about on this album. It's called Solitude. And probably a lot of people haven't, you know, it's not a real popular tune, but I was listening to it last night prepping for this. And to me, it's kind of like, it sounds like somebody's tripping out, like going on a drug trip. I mean, it's not quite what I can call a ballad, but it's kind of just real trippy sound. And it's kind of interesting. It's kind of something like I've never heard before.
Well, you know, I before we started talking today,
Yeah.
I listened to it again.
Yeah.
And you know, Solitude, you know, is kind of like a ethereal
Yeah.
Kind of, piece. But I think that just goes into that whole experimentation thing that they were talking about when they were saying it was an experimentative album.
And you wonder why a song like that hasn't gotten maybe more airplay. I mean, probably realistically speaking, because it doesn't have a great great sing along beat or anything like that. But it's a fun little thing to kind of listen to, and you're kind of getting off and like, wow, that's different,
Well, even though the song's really not on Masters of Reality, but I think Paranoid is one of those songs that just
sticks in your head, like.
Well, it's one of those prime examples of you never know which song is going to become the big hit.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because really, when they actually came out with that song, it was thrown together at the last minute because they didn't have enough songs for the album,
and
they had to come up with something really quick.
And a lot of albums, you expect they're going to have at least 10 tracks. Like this album only has 8 tracks, and so it's a little short.
8 long tracks, though. Some of these songs are like 10 minutes. Over 10 minutes long. And another thing that was that why they called it AOR back in the 70s, album-oriented rock, was because there was a lot of bands that were experimenting with long songs.
Yeah, and that's another influence these guys had on a band like Metallica. Like, if you go listen to any of the Metallica albums that predate like the Black Album, they had a thing that they were kind of like, Metallica I'm talking about, they would have like 9-minute tracks on their album. And then by the time they got to the Black Album, I guess they kind of said, you know what, we want to kind of structure, the stuff we're writing for the Black Album kind of a little more radio oriented, because they're not going to play a 9-minute track on the radio. And, but before that Black Album, that's what they were known for doing is, and they didn't really care. They kind of, this is what we do, and we don't care if you like it. We want to do a 9-minute track. We're going to do a 9-minute track, and that's kind of a Sabbath influence on them.
And during that time, that's when they started getting critics, positive reviews by the critics.
Yeah. I mean, even going back to like a song like
the critics were panning Metallica.
I mean, ever since
another classic example of when the critics are panning you, you're on to something.
Yeah, Enter Sandman. Ever since Enter Sandman, that was released as a single, critics have been loving on Metallica. That's in order to be really a true artist, you have to be experimenting. Yeah.
If you're always, the labels, back in those days, they just looked at things in terms of how much money they can make.
Yeah.
So put out another Paranoid. Put out another, Enter Sandman.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's all the label cares about is they just want you to put out something that sells big.
And here's an interesting thing about this album. I was reading. It peaked at number 5 on the UK chart. Which, think about this. That's where the band was from. So their own home country kind of knew something before the rest of the world. Whereas the album, it did really good in the US. It peaked at like number 8, not quite as good as number 5 in the UK, but again, for a little band out of England at the time, it's trying to make some noise. Having an album on the Billboard chart in the US at number 8, that's pretty good.
That's what's, to me, it's monumental.
Yeah.
Because it just goes back to what I was talking about earlier. England is not this gigantic country, but yet it put out so much talent.
Oh, yeah.
Extremely creative talent, game-changing talent.
Oh, no doubt.
You know what I mean? And just the list of extremely strong, it put out bands like Queen.
Oh, yeah.
When you think about this, the little country that could because there's so much talent that came out of that country, and then you're talking about another band like Black Sabbath that just came out of a little old place called Birmingham.
Yeah, different sound, different British band, but they all had their impact. Even a band like another band we're gonna have to do an episode on that I know you equally love as I do is Slade. That's another great British band.
Yes.
Yeah. So just three great British bands we've mentioned in this one episode, and they all have a different, unique sound, but they've all made their mark on the world. And I think I got to ask you before we wrap this up for today, Gar, what do you think about Bill Ward as a drummer, what he brought in the band? Because a lot of people don't realize that he was much more of a jazz drummer than even a rock drummer, and that's kind of what he brought into the band.
Well, back in those days, of course, my focus was on bass.
Bass, yeah.
And bass and drums
go together,
go hand in hand. Yeah. And so yes, I was really challenged by trying to learn how to play note for note bass lines that had a lot of improvisation that was going on. But another thing that the music that Black Sabbath was putting out at that time, that I wasn't aware of it at that time, but it was also teaching me how to lock with the drummer, and how to, because you see, when you're learning to improvise, you can't improvise as a bass player unless you're influenced by the drummer.
Yeah.
And so his drumming style had a natural, fit
for the band.
For me, in learning how to get that natural fit. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. And
I'm in the process of learning, and it was that his style of drums, because I was using that as a learning vehicle.
Oh yeah.
Was teaching me how to have that natural fit with what the drums were doing, because I just realized if I was ruining the records, because these were all done with a needle, and you're having to pick up the needle and move it back, and each time you do that, you do more damage, and eventually you wind up ruining the record by moving the needle back so many times. And I realized that what the bass player was doing a lot of improvising. So I started improvising, and I started trying to, but you can't do that without having a drum to get the feel for the improvisation.
I got to ask, Gar, do you remember?
It's really hard to describe.
I get it.
Because it's not following the beaten path. You're just feeling it, and you're just trying to come up with whatever you're doing on bass to fit it.
Especially playing a bass. A bass is you really are playing with your feeling. I mean, you can kind of, when you're listening to somebody, like one of my all-time favorite tracks as far as Sabbath is concerned with the bass would probably be NIB, Nativity in Black. Great bass riff.
Well, there's so many. There's also the aspect of what Tony Iommi was doing, which is very groove-oriented guitar playing.
Yeah, and you gotta correct myself there. I was reading last night about the track I just said. It's NIB. Most people know it as. I don't know why a lot of people think it means Nativity in Black, but I was reading, interesting enough, NIB is actually it's nib, which is, I guess, it was about they wrote the song about Bill Ward's kind of goatee beard at the time. Again, just a fun little tune about somebody's beard. I mean, how original is that? But it's cool to learn these little interesting facts about the band.
Well, it's just you know, they were my learning grounds, because, you know, previous to that, a lot of the music, you know, that I was doing was, you know, much more simplistic, you know, because I was very, very green as a musician. And the early Black Sabbath music, you know, especially Masters of Reality, that was my where a period for me musically where I really started expanding my wings. And I really have to hand it to, you know, you can't expand your wings as a musician if you're not you don't have a personal connection to the actual music.
Oh yeah, and,
does that make sense? You know, there has to be something, a personal thing where you're loving this music and you're inspired by this music, and it just makes you want to find out where they came from with when they came up with it, and start feeling it yourself.
It has to go back to what makes you gravitate towards this band, in the sense from the time you heard the first album, I mean you didn't turn away after that. I mean, you know, by the time Master Reality is released in 1971, you're still a fan. You're still following what they're doing. So they're on the upward swing. You're liking what they're doing. I got to ask, Gar, do you remember what was the first Sabbath riff you kind of learned how to riff off of?
Oh, it has to be Paranoid.
Wow, yeah.
You know, you know, and then again, you know, it's that and Sweet Leaf.
Yeah. Now,
those were like songs, you know, that would allow me to start diving in and have some success.
Yeah. Okay. And that's interesting. And here's the final question for today. As a vocalist yourself, how important do you think the environment that you record something in? I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, I was reading that, you know, this album was recorded, I believe, still somewhere in England, but then by the time they got to the next album, they decided, okay, we're going to leave our homeland of England. We're going to record an album in Los Angeles, California. And I've read in this, they put out this great reissue of Volume 4, and they have this cool little book that came along, and I was reading where they said, man, what a different environment. We're recording the fourth album in beautiful, sunny Los Angeles, California. And by the time we're recording this album, the drug we moved on to is now, you know, we're in the recording studio where we're getting high on cocaine and all this. But I mean, just, you know, from going, let's say, to industrial England to recording the fourth album in beautiful, sunny Los Angeles, how big of an effect do you think that had on the band as far as the sound kind of progressing?
Well, I mean, all I can do is speculate, you know, but you know, I think, you know, for any artist, whether you're painting or whether you're making music or whether you're sculpting, you know, influence is always part of your own creativity.
There you go.
When you never know what that influence is gonna be.
Yeah.
You know, whenever, you know, it could be watching a TV show. It could be where you're at and what you were feeling where you were at. But you just never know, you know, you can never formulate creativity.
Yeah.
The only thing that you can do is embrace whatever it is that influences you.
Yeah, and it's kind of
interesting. The real artists know how to recognize it and embrace it. That's, you know, I think only an artist that's experienced it. You know, but artists that experience it, that's their air that they breathe. They're not looking for the influence, you know, but all of a sudden something happens and you latch onto it.
Yeah.
Okay, there it is. There it is.
Yeah, and
you see what I mean? And then you embrace it, and you allow that to influence whatever it is.
Yeah.
For Randy Rhoads, I used to read about, even though he was playing with Ozzy and having all this huge success, he was still taking lessons from other people, not to learn something that he didn't know, but to find a new influence, because these teachers that were teaching him were going into areas that were not familiar for him. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And
allowing him to go into unfamiliar territories allowed him to expand and go and have that influence his new areas of creativity. To me, that was genius. To me, that was, I totally saw it as to why he was doing it, and I understood. A lot of people that are, much more simplistic in their thinking will go, well, why would he need to go take it? Obviously, he wasn't as good as he needed to be. Yeah. There's your difference between a creative mind and somebody that just will never see it.
Yeah, and just to take that point home, in regards to Randy Rhoads, I mean, it's amazing the guy with just those two Ozzy albums has left behind, a huge legacy. I mean, that he has with just two albums, huge fan base. What a lot of people do not realize is, his gig with Ozzy, I mean, from everything I've ever heard or read, unfortunately he died in that horrible plane crash, but he was not planning to stay with Ozzy for years and years. He was planning to eventually leave Ozzy's band and maybe go and have a classical music career, because he was much more into classical music than even rock music. I mean, he played in this other little band, Quiet Riot, before Ozzy, but that was kind of his thought process, is he wanted to have a classical career and music, and it never kind of got the chance to do that. But with just those two Ozzy albums, look at the huge legacy that guy has.
Yes. But he understood about creativity, because you can never keep being creative unless you're always expanding and trying to go out into new areas.
Yeah, and I imagine,
you see what I mean? It wasn't like Ozzy wouldn't be good enough for him.
Yeah.
He just saw it that there's just going to come a time when, in order to have longevity, you have to go into other areas.
Oh, yeah.
You see what I mean? When you look at, musicians or artists or even singers, one of the reasons why the career went for so long is because nothing ever stayed the same. They kept expanding. They kept growing and going into different areas and finding new, influences, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And whenever you're doing that, you have a much better chance at having a longer career.
Oh yeah, and if
you stay the same, you get mundane and it becomes repetitive, monotonous.
Yeah, and I think we're at an interesting point in Black Sabbath's career 50 years later, because all four guys are they're still physically here. Interesting enough, I think part of the reason Sabbath kind of called it a day a few years back was because I think at the time Ozzy knew that he's dealing with this Parkinson's thing. I mean, he just announced this last year, and so Sabbath's kind of gone as far as they can. They want to end on a high note, which makes sense. And we're at an interesting point where they're re-releasing a lot of these classic Sabbath albums. The most recent one they've done is Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules a few months ago. They also did a cool reissue of Volume 4. I heard the next thing they have coming out is Sabotage, a cool 4 CD reissue coming out, I think, June 11th. So we have that to look forward. And we're kind of looking back on these classic Sabbath albums now. And, 50 years later, it's kind of cool to look back on a band that's had a career that long. And you have a newfound respect and love for the music that they released, 50 years ago. And they've had a career since, but it's kind of interesting that even if you look at the last album they did with Ozzy Osbourne, which was, I think, around 2013, I think the album was 13. It was a good album, but I don't really know that it stands up, in my opinion, to a lot of the classic Sabbath albums we've been talking about. And I think there's a reason for that, because in every band, like you're saying, there's a time where, you know, there's that classic kind of period. Even a band like The Who, you go back and we listen to all those classic Who albums we love, but you know, they put out a new studio album, you know, a couple years back, and I think it was a decent album, but it doesn't, and I don't know why it doesn't stand up to that classic stuff, but because there's a point in every band's career where just there's that magic moment where they're writing all these great tunes, but I mean, when you've been around 50 years, you can only do so much, you know.
Exactly, but also another aspect of it is when you're early in your career, you're hungry.
Yeah, it's a lot more raw. You want it a lot more. Yeah.
Yes. There's a going after it.
Yeah.
Aspect, and you know, just you know, that, you know, when you've been doing it for 50 years and you've got that, you know, that whole career, you know, you don't have that hunger like you had when you were earlier in your career.
Yeah, it's kind of like,
you know, there's not that urgency.
Yeah, it's kind of like been there, done that, in the sense that, I mean, really, Black Sabbath's at a great place, you know, 50 years later. 50 years later, they're a band that most critics will tell you, you know, when you point to metal, that's one of the bands that really made their mark. I mean, like I said, this album we're talking about today, at the time, critics panned the album. 50 years later, they're calling it a masterpiece. I mean, like with with anything you talk about in life, music, whatever we're talking about, it ages like fine wine. The more it's around, the more people are going to love it. So there's a new respect for Sabbath that there wasn't 50 years ago. But they made their mark in the world. They never tour again. They never release another album. I'm happy with what they've done.
Well, and it also tells you what the critics know.
Yeah. and the critics, and what I love about critics is they only know like what's popular. Like if the album, you know, the album comes out, like let's take a Van Halen album. The album of Gary Sharon they did, I think it's a decent album. I love it, but people pan that album. But you know what? If it was to become a number one album, people were to go and buy it, and it was a big hit, people would be loving it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Well, Gar,
yeah.
I want to thank you for going back in time to 1971 today. And next time, we're going to do it again. I think next time you and I decide we're going to be talking about Jaws, one of your all-time favorite films, and that's going to be so much fun because, I mean, when we did our premiere episode talking about 90 Years of Dracula, you had a list in there about some of your favorite movies of all time, and you listed on there Jaws. And when we were talking, you made me realize that, you know, because it's 1975 when the original Jaws came out. It's been so many years. I totally forgot what it was like to see that first original Jaws. That, I mean, it's on the movie screen, but people were so terrified. So I'm going to have fun talking with you next time about that.
Absolutely. I love doing this, Jason.
Okay, so
I really can't thank you enough for coming up with this idea.
Yeah.
You know, it's such an honor to actually be doing this. It really is an honor.
And I got to say, you know, more and more people are joining our Gar Borras fan page on Facebook, and we encourage it. So keep doing that, and we're going to keep posting stuff up there. But yeah, this has been fun, and I think what makes it so much fun is we're talking about more than just music. I mean, you and I could talk for hours and hours about music, but there's so much more to love. I mean, besides music, we have love for TV shows, movies. So that's what I think makes it so much fun. When you tune in each month, you never know what you're going to get, and it's a little different because of that.
Well, thank you.
Well, I couldn't do it without you, my friend. So you have a nice rest of the day, and I'll be talking to you later. Bye.
Talk to you later.